Well, today is Labor Day in the United States, notable for not being on May the 1st. Frankly, I would prefer that there was no commie Labor Day, uh, although not having a Labor Day and not putting it on May 1st is a decent compromise. After all, we see the terrible violence and unrest that you get from communist riots on May Day every year around the world. I'm glad that we are somewhat spared by that here in the United States because of the co-opting of the labor movement during the Progressive era. Um, I wouldn't say that it's a positive a silver lining of the Progressive era, but I guess it could have been worse. But with that out of the way, I thought today would be a good day to update my not forecast, but my sense of where the U.S. is in its current state of decline. How far are we away from uh, a total collapse of some sort, of breakdown of the American system or of American society? Um, I won't give timetables. I don't do that. I think that people who try and be soothsayers and say beware the Ides of March are always end up looking dumb in the long run. Um, I'm not going to, I'm not going to say, hey, this year in history is going to be when the American empire is going to finally collapse in its entirety. But I can gauge what direction we're moving in and sort of how fast what things are looking, and that's what I try and do on this channel from time to time. Last year was obviously a big step in the wrong direction if you're rooting for the continued existence and prosperity of the United States. We had, of course, the Wu flu, which early on looked like it was going to finally pop the very long in the tooth economic bubble that we are currently in, have been since the end of 09-ish, I guess, was when the recovery started. I think 09 was what Joe Biden termed a recovery summer. And so that bubble is well over a decade old at this point. It's 12 years old, getting close to 13 years old. And I I felt very strongly last year that the nature of these lockdowns. I said, gee, if there was ever going to be a pin to prick an economic bubble, this would be it. And while technically using the typical definitions of a recession, we did have a slight recession. It was not a recession. It was not the recession that we've been waiting on. It was not the bursting of the bubble. The bubble not only was able to keep all the air inside, it blew up bigger than any of us could have ever imagined. And this is true across all sectors. Uh, Real estate, of course, stocks, bonds, even used cars and the like. Of course, when it comes to a lot of consumer goods and things, and maybe used cars and stuff, that's supply chain related more than it is bubble related. And so I guess you could call used cars a bubble of a different kind. It's not the usual asset bubble that I'm referring to when I refer to the bubble in general. Then, of course, we had all the riots last year, which um, I argued at the time were not just some organic resurgence of the Black Lives Matter movement. I didn't think that it was just, all of a sudden now people care about black people again. I thought that it was pretty clearly um, related. I didn't want to say correlated because obviously it's correlated, chronologically. It was related to the economic strife of last year because the real economy has taken a big hit. But as long as asset prices do not revert to the mean and do not fall, down to where the fundamental value is, where if the prices of assets like real estate, stocks, and bonds don't fall to where they to the prices that they would be in in an actual free market economy, I don't think that there will be a recognition of the economic problems in this country. As long as asset prices are high, people remain fairly confident. Now, consumer confidence has been waning recently. It's not looking good. We're not seeing a lot of jobs being created. And so I think a lot of people would start to think, okay, the Fed and the authorities were able to paper over last year with a bunch of stimulus, unprecedented stimulus, but now, we're going to have to take our medicine. Now that's kind of wearing off, and, the bill is coming due, and, we're going to have our hangover. And frankly, I just don't quite see that being the case. Last year, I didn't think that the U.S., if I remember correctly, I believe my initial thoughts, and that I maintained throughout most of the year, was that the U.S. government was not going to allow recession. I didn't think Trump would want that, especially during an election year. I don't think, I thought that as much money was going to be spent by the federal government as needed, even if that led to a great inflation. And what we're seeing right now is not what I would term, a great inflation. I think 1970s double-digit inflation or high single-digit inflation sustained for many years. That I would call a great inflation. But that's just not something that we see manifest in a matter of months. I don't think that just because we're starting to see the pains of inflation that we're on, that this bubble is on death's door. I think that the kinds of booms and busts that we saw, in the Greenspan era, and that really continued through Bernanke and even Yellen, since they were both, Greenspan underlings to a certain extent, particularly Bernanke. The understanding was you blow a big bubble, and then you pop it. You blow a big bubble, and then you pop it. Rinse and repeat over and over and over again. And as I've said over and over about Jerome Powell, he doesn't want to play that game. He just wants the bubble to grow and grow and grow ceaselessly. And the folks in Congress, of course, would like nothing less as well. The Democrats control both houses of Congress. They have midterms coming up next year. They don't want there to be any sort of economic problems if they can avoid it. Republicans, likewise, perhaps because of budgetary reasons, because they still like to sometimes call themselves budget hawks, they will oppose these things for the sake of the Democrats. But I think once we see a 5 or 10% correction, and I think I discussed this a bit with when I was talking about Joe Manchin essentially vetoing the $3.5 trillion stimulus bill. There needs to be a slight pullback in asset prices to scare the Republicans into joining forces with the Democrats. I don't think that the Republicans have the stomach to allow the bubble to burst, which I think would happen without sufficient stimulus, without continued inflation. If the government does not continue its deficit spending, it's that is of course funded through debt monetization by the Fed. So the government, in a roundabout way, is printing money and spending it into existence. And so if it becomes clear that Congress really is going to put their foot down, at least in the short term, and say no more stimulus, that will, in due time, cause a panic on Wall Street. And that panic will reverberate and be felt back in Washington, D.C., because, of course, people, particularly in the Senate, people in Congress are high net worth individuals. Even if they aren't when they get there, by the time they get out, they got a pretty decent sized portfolio. Very much in the top 1%. That goes without saying. It's a matter of, what decimal point of the top 1% are they in? And so, as we saw when Trump was president, Republicans, when they thought that their portfolios were at risk, were very happy to go along with, so-called big government deficit spending, the greatest deficits in American history. Even during even before the Wu flu, they were running record deficits, but they were happy to, double or triple or do whatever was necessary last year in order to, in their eyes, keep their assets from deflating. And so I don't think that we'll have a clean break with this business cycle. We will not be able to draw a line like we could, with 2008. There will be no 2008 event, I don't think. I don't think that the authorities will allow that. I think what we're going to see is maybe this game of chicken between Wall Street and Washington, where Washington, wants to cut off Wall Street from their easy money, from Washington money, and Wall Street will cut off D.C. from their money. All the while, every time Washington gives in, the dollar loses, more and more value, or rather, I should say inflation, because the dollar's always losing value. Inflation will accelerate. It will go up higher and higher. And the longer this is drawn out, the more of a prolonged period this will be. I think that this will be a number of years. And at the end of it, when things sort of settle and balance out, we're going to look a lot more like modern Japan than the United States of, 2018. That's in terms of economic activity. However, I don't think that we will be able to escape with the lack of inflation that the Japanese have, depending on how you look at it, benefited from. And so I think as the system becomes sort of waterlogged with stimulus, and as it loses its potency, because of course it is largely psychological. It is the idea, just like when the Fed used to, cut the Fed funds rate or talk about cutting the Fed funds rate, stocks would go up just on that news. It's because people's perception of the situation improved. Same thing is true every time, Congress passes one of these, pork-laden stimulus bills. You think they help the economy. Of course they don't. But they improve sentiments, and those sentiments lead people to purchase assets because they are more confident that those assets will go up in value in the future. But all of these promises lose potency over time. I don't know when stimulus from Congress will lose its potency, but I think it will probably be a few years at the very least. And so depending on how Congress plays this, they could drag out this slow and malaise it's hard for me to say a decade. It's really hard for me to believe that after the decade that we've just had, that there wouldn't be a single pullback, that there wouldn't be a serious, sustained 20% drop ever, no bear market. But I mean, let's say 3 years would not surprise me at this point. I've been surprised so many times already in my rather young life. As far as I'm concerned, these people will go to any length to keep this cycle going. And so, with that said, until the United States, is a pile of ashes, the way I look at it is the authorities still have some more ammo to fire off at the albatross of depression. Forgive me for making very dumb and mixing up analogies and things. I'm not. My mind's not entirely clear. I have a bit of a sore throat and didn't sleep all that well. But as long as you get my point, I think that'll be fine. You see, there are something else to consider. There are social ramifications for all of these policies. They have been destructive to our society going back to the post-war era, the very beginning of it. There's been nothing that's been more of an enemy of traditional family values in this country than the inability um, of a man to provide for a wife and children economically. It's just not possible these days, unless you're in, like, let's say, the top 5%, maybe. And without getting into details, that's a result of the choices made by our economic authorities. It's not an accident that it takes two parents working full time to support a single child these days. And so, likewise, this era is going to produce all sorts of distortions and degradations in our society that we don't really understand yet. Perhaps it's the erosion of the general work ethic of the public. I keep forgetting to check labor force participation. Okay, so 61.87% according to the Fed right now. I finally just checked. I'm so tired. I keep bringing up labor force participation rate because I know it's abysmally low. It was, I think, in the mid 60s for most of this era of the bubble. It broke down. It was in the high 60s before that. Broke down after 2008, never recovered. It broke down again last year, recovered a little bit. I think it was in the 50s last year for a very brief period of time. But now we're barely above 60%. And shifts like that have consequences socially. As less and less people work, you're going to see an erosion of purpose. You're going to see, a rise in depression, as of course, if you're unemployed and you're still getting by, whether you're homeless or whether you're living on welfare or what have you, as long as you're not in the labor force, you're not even looking for work. You don't have much. Even if you're kind of satisfied with where you are in life, you're happy living. Or I shouldn't say happy. You're satisfied. You feel like, hey, I've got a roof over my head. Maybe if you're living in a shelter or something like that. You're not someone who has hope for improving your station in life. The more homeless people you have, I think there's a high propensity for them to be swept up into some kind of mass movement. And those sorts of mass movements are what can usher in radical political shifts in any country. I'm almost 20 minutes into this, and there's so much to consider. I mean, I just pulled that one out of a hat. There's plenty of other things you could talk about that are potential results of what we are witnessing right now in the United States. But I have to say, none of the side effects of this stimulus era that we've now entered are positive. It's hard for even someone like me to have hope when it looks like this situation can just continue to go on forever. I had more hope back when I thought that we were, on the precipice and that there was a chance that the authorities were well, I shouldn't say that. I never thought that the authorities were going to let the bubble burst. But I was hoping that the fire hose of stimulus was going to have such a that the bad effects of it were going to show up so quickly that the stimulus was unable to really effectively extend the business cycle. In other words, even if the stimulus, solved the problem of, supposedly low GDP, falling GDP, which of course is just an accounting trick. GDP doesn't really matter in any real sense. But leaving that aside, the stimulus is supposed to boost GDP. Well, if it, boosted GDP and significantly and boosted, inflation, more so than it is now, let's say by 8%, I think at that point it would be clear that there was nothing much that could be done, that this was a hopeless situation, that the bubble was going to have to be allowed to burst. But where inflation is now in official terms, I don't think that it's as bad as everybody says. And of course, I think I mean relatively. To me, I think that this current level of inflation, if it didn't get any worse than it is right now, uh, the and we still have all the growth from the bubble era, I think that this could continue on indefinitely. And I mean, all else equal, if we just the past year, the economics of the past year, if you just extended that out and drew a straight line, uh, following the trend from this past year, I think that society, the political leaders, the Fed, they would all be just fine with that. And so I'm still looking for inflation to get worse. But inflation's not going to get worse if you have a Congress that is actually somewhat concerned about inflation at this stage. That brings me back to Joe Manchin and the Republicans and the necessity for a coming stock market correction that Congress will have to reconvene and end up passing the $3.5 trillion stimulus bill in order to fight. Maybe I should do a whiteboard like George Gammon for something like this, but a chronological one, because there's a lot of steps here, more than 3 steps actually. So maybe I wouldn't be like George Gammon. And who knows? I don't use any notes when I talk about these things. I just sort of think out loud, and so maybe I've said it in a very confusing way. Maybe what I'll do after today, I will I'll consider this like a brainstorming session. I'll listen to this over, try and condense my thoughts, and maybe actually write something out. Not a script, certainly, but write out some notes, and go over things in a logical order as to more different scenarios for where we can go from here. Sort of an update of my 3 roads to economic ruin. Which, oh, by the way, I know we're sort of getting closer to fall, and back then I thought that we might start to see some things start to come apart by fall. And I think that kind of lines up with how I'm feeling now about Congress and the stimulus situation. I think we'll need to have a very minor, not quite a correction, but a very minor pullback from all-time highs in order to jumpstart the new stimulus process. But it certainly won't be the end by any means. So, with that said, I will see you folks back here tomorrow.